Hello, and welcome back to Void Whispers. Before the tale begins, drop your location in the comments. Let's see who's listening from where. Quick note, the first 10 minutes have around 2-3 ads. After that, the entire video is ad-free. If Void Whispers' dark atmosphere speaks to you, like the video and subscribe with notifications. Now, get comfortable. Dim the lights if you dare. Relax your mind. Let the outside world fade away. And let's begin. Story 1, the last pieces of wood in the campfire cracked and hissed as they slowly burned down. Small sparks rose into the warm night air before disappearing above the dark pine trees. The flames threw broken orange shadows across the clearing, making the trees look as though they were moving whenever the wind touched their branches. It was a humid July night at Camp Willow Wood. The air felt thick and wet, almost like a warm blanket pressed against the skin. Sweat clung to the backs of the campers' necks, and the smell of smoke mixed with pine needles, damp soil, and the muddy water of the nearby lake. Crickets screamed from every direction, so loudly that their sound seemed to pulse inside the girls' chests. 5 girls sat close together on rough log benches around the fire. They wore oversized camp shirts, shorts, and old sneakers. Their hair was tied back in loose ponytails that had become messy after a long day of swimming, hiking, and running through the woods. A few empty marshmallow sticks lay in the dirt near their feet, and a half-open bag of chocolate rested on the bench between them. Amber sat in the center of the group as if she were the leader of some secret meeting. She was 13 years old, thin, sharp-eyed, and always ready to turn an ordinary moment into something dramatic. She loved telling stories, especially when she knew people were listening. Even during the day, she could make a simple walk to the lake sound like a dangerous journey through cursed land. That night, with the fire burning low and the counselors busy near the dining hall, Amber knew she had the perfect audience. She leaned forward and lowered her voice. "Do you guys want to hear the real story about this camp?" The other girls looked at her. Sally rolled her eyes, but she also moved a little closer to the fire. "Is this about the lake monster again?" Sally asked. "Because you said it had 3 heads last time, and then yesterday you said it only had 1. Amber gave her a cold look. "No, this is not about the lake monster." "What is it about, then?" Chloe asked. Amber glanced around the clearing as if she wanted to make sure no one else was listening. Beyond the firelight, the woods formed a wall of darkness. The cabins could barely be seen through the trees, and the yellow lights in their windows looked very far away. "This is about a girl named Claire," Amber said. "She was a camper here exactly 40 years ago, back in 1986. The girls became quiet. To them, 1986 sounded like another world. It seemed like a time of old television sets, cassette tapes, bright clothes, and photographs that had faded at the edges. It was difficult for them to imagine Camp Willowwood existing that long ago, even though the old wooden cabins and cracked stone paths looked as if they had been there forever. Amber waited until she had their full attention. Claire was different, she continued. She stayed in cabin 9, and all the other girls thought she was strange. While everyone else made friendship bracelets, practiced archery, or learned how to paddle a canoe, Claire sat alone in the middle of the clearing and stared into empty spaces. Tamara pulled her knees against her chest. What was she staring at? No one knew, Amber said. At least, not in the beginning. A gust of wind moved through the trees. The flames bent sideways, and the shadows around them stretched across the ground. After a few days, people started noticing things, Amber went on. They saw Claire talking when no one was near her. Sometimes she stood beside the dining hall, smiling and nodding like someone was telling her a joke. Other times, she whispered to the empty bed beside her in the middle of the night. Maybe she had an imaginary friend, Sally said. Amber shook her head slowly. She had more than one. The girls exchanged nervous looks. Some campers said Claire could see dead people, Amber said. Not just people who had died at the camp, but spirits that followed visitors from other places. She knew things she should not have known. She once told a counselor that her dead grandmother did not like the red curtains in her apartment. The counselor had never spoken about her grandmother or her apartment, but the curtains really were red. Tamara's eyes widened. So Claire was a medium? Exactly, Amber replied. But no one believed her. They thought she was crazy. The fire popped loudly, and Sally jumped. Amber smiled for a moment, pleased with the effect, before continuing. The other girls started making fun of her. They called her Spooky Claire. They hid her shoes before breakfast and placed dead insects inside her pillowcase. One night, they tied bells to the bottom of her bed so they would ring whenever she moved. They wanted to prove she was pretending to talk to ghosts just to get attention. That's mean, Chloe whispered. Claire did not care, Amber said. She never cried in front of them. She never shouted. She simply kept talking to the people no one else could see. What did the ghosts say to her? Tamara asked. Amber's expression turned serious. They warned her that something terrible was going to happen. The girls leaned closer. For 3 nights, Claire dreamed about fire, Amber said. She saw flames climbing the cabin walls. She saw black smoke pouring through the windows. She heard girls screaming, but whenever she tried to reach them, invisible hands held her back. Chloe looked over her shoulder toward the cabins. Did she tell anyone? She tried, Amber said, but everyone laughed at her. The counselors told her to stop frightening the younger campers. The girls in her cabin said she was only trying to get attention. One of them told Claire that if she talked about the dream again, they would lock her outside all night. Amber paused and stared into the flames. Then, one night, something happened. No one spoke. A scream woke up half the camp, Amber said softly. It came from cabin 9. Counselors ran through the woods with flashlights, but when they reached the cabin, Claire was gone. Gone where? Sally asked. No one knew. Her bed was empty. Her shoes were still under it. Her suitcase was still packed beside the wall. There were no footprints outside the window and no signs of a struggle. It was as if she had vanished while everyone was sleeping. Tamara shivered, though the night was warm. Did they search the forest? They searched everywhere, Amber said. They checked the cabins, the lake, the trails, and even the old storage buildings. Police came with dogs, but the dogs would not follow Claire's scent beyond this clearing. Amber pointed toward the ground beneath them. This clearing? Chloe asked. Amber nodded. They say Claire came here that night and spoke to the ghosts one last time. Then the spirits she had been talking to decided to take her home with them. For several seconds, the girls sat in silence. A low branch scraped against the trunk of a tree, making a dry scratching sound. Somewhere deeper in the forest, an owl called. Tamara gave a nervous laugh. That is actually kind of cool. That is not cool, Sally said. It is horrible. Do you think she is still out there? Chloe asked. Like in the woods? Amber opened her mouth to answer, but no sound came out. A shadow had fallen across the girls. It did not come from the moving trees or the smoke. Someone was standing behind them. Claire did not disappear, Amber, a woman's voice said. All 5 girls screamed and turned around. A tall woman stood just beyond the circle of firelight. She wore a navy blue polo shirt with the Camp Willowwood logo over the chest and khaki shorts. A whistle hung from a cord around her neck. Her brown hair was streaked with silver, and deep lines surrounded her tired eyes. She looked older than the girls' parents, but not as old as their grandparents. There was something familiar about her face, though none of them could understand why. The woman stepped closer. The firelight showed the sadness in her eyes. It was not the ordinary sadness of someone having a bad day. It looked old, heavy, and permanent, as if she had carried it for most of her life. Amber stood up, trying to hide the fear in her voice. "Who are you?" The woman looked directly at her. "My name is Claire." The girls stared at her. Tamara's mouth fell open. "You are Claire? The Claire from the story?" The woman nodded. "But that is impossible," Sally said. "Amber said you disappeared 40 years ago." "I did not disappear," Claire replied softly. "I grew up." Amber forced a laugh. "No, you did not. The real Claire vanished. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows the story," Claire said. "But stories change when people repeat them for long enough." She stepped fully into the firelight. For a moment, the flames seemed to become brighter, and the clearing around her appeared sharper. The girls' faces were pale and still. The smoke moved around them, but never made them cough. Claire looked from one girl to another. "I have heard this story many times," she said. "Every summer, you tell it again. Sometimes you say I drowned in the lake. Sometimes you say a creature in the forest took me. Sometimes you say the ghosts carried me away." Amber crossed her arms. "So what? It is just a campfire story." "No," Claire said. "It is the only version of that night you are willing to remember." The girls looked at one another. "What are you talking about?" Chloe asked. Claire's eyes returned to Amber. "You have always been good at telling stories," she said, "even when you were alive." The fire cracked. Amber's face tightened. "We are alive." Claire took a slow breath. Her hands trembled at her sides. "I was 12 years old in the summer of 1986, she said. "I stayed in the cabin beside yours. I was shy, and I spent a lot of time alone. Maybe that made me strange to you. Maybe it made you think I was weak." "You talk to ghosts," Tamara said. Claire looked at her. "No, I talked to myself because no one else wanted to talk to me." Tamara looked down. "You laughed at me," Claire continued. "You hid my clothes. You threw mud on my bed. You told everyone I could see spirits because you heard me whispering when I was afraid." Amber shook her head. "That never happened." "It did," Claire said. "But that is not the part you are hiding." The wind stopped. The crickets suddenly became quiet, and the silence of the forest pressed around the clearing. Claire looked toward the cabins. It was the hottest week of the summer, she said. The air inside the cabins was thick, and no one could sleep. The counselors had warned us not to light candles or matches. The wooden walls were old and dry, and the sleeping bags were made from cheap nylon that could catch fire quickly. Amber's eyes narrowed. "What does that have to do with anything?" "You wanted to impress the older girls," Claire said. "You had stolen a pack of cigarettes from one of the kitchen workers." Amber stared at her. "That is a lie." "You waited until the counselor left the cabin," Claire continued. "Then you closed the door and showed everyone what you had taken. Sally said it was a bad idea. Chloe told you to throw them away. But you called them babies. Sally turned toward Amber. I did not. Claire looked at Sally. You did. You were afraid, but you did not leave. Sally's face changed. For a second, confusion passed through her eyes, followed by something darker. A memory, perhaps. Then she shook her head hard. No, we were here. We were sitting around the fire. You lit one cigarette, Claire said to Amber. You coughed so much that the others laughed. You pretended it did not bother you. Then you placed it on the edge of your sleeping bag when you heard footsteps outside. Amber's voice became louder. Stop it. You thought a counselor was coming, Claire said. You hid the cigarettes under your mattress. You forgot the one that was still burning. Stop talking. The footsteps belonged to no one. It was only a branch rubbing against the wall. Amber covered her ears. You are making this up. Claire continued, even though tears had started running down her face. The cigarette rolled into a fold in the sleeping bag. The nylon melted first. Then the blanket caught fire. By the time anyone noticed the smell, flames had already reached the wooden wall. Tamara stood up. That did not happen. I saw the smoke from my cabin, Claire said. At first I thought it was fog. Then I saw the orange light inside your window. The campfire grew louder. Flames rose above the stones, though no one had added more wood. I ran outside. Claire continued. I screamed for the counselors. I tried to reach your cabin, but the door would not open. Something had fallen against it. From the inside. Sally began to cry. No, I heard all of you screaming, Claire said. I heard you hitting the door. I heard the windows break from the heat. Chloe backed away from the fire. We are not dead. The smoke filled the cabin in minutes, Claire said. I stood outside and watched the roof burn. I saw shadows moving behind the glass. Then the shadows stopped. Amber pointed at Claire. You are lying. Look at us. We are standing right here. The other girls gathered around Amber. Yeah, Tamara said quickly. We are fine. We are at camp, Sally added, wiping her eyes. It is July. We are having a campfire. Claire's shoulders shook. It is July, she said, but it is not 1986. Amber glanced around. The clearing looked the same as it always had. The fire was bright. The benches were solid beneath their feet. The pine trees stood tall around them, and the cabins waited beyond the darkness. Claire reached toward Amber, but did not touch her. You have been sitting here for 40 years. Amber's face twisted with anger. No, every summer, when the air is warm and the moon is high, I come back to this clearing, Claire said. And every summer I find you in the same place, telling the same story. No, you begin with the campfire. You tell everyone I was strange. You say I disappeared. Then, when I tell you what really happened, you refuse to listen. We are not dead. Chloe screamed. Claire turned to her. You are trapped in the last memory that felt safe. You had come to this clearing earlier that evening. You ate marshmallows. You told ghost stories. When the fire happened later that night, your minds returned here. Amber's breathing became fast and shallow. That is impossible. Look at your clothes, Claire said. Amber looked down. At first, she saw only her bright pink camp shirt and denim shorts. Then the fire flickered. The pink fabric turned black. A long, burned hole appeared across her stomach. The edges of the shirt curled inward, stiff and melted. Gray ash covered her arms. Her skin was dark, cracked and peeling like old paper. Amber screamed. The other girls looked down at themselves. Tamara's ponytail was gone. Half of her hair had burned away, leaving a blackened patch along the side of her head. Sally's shirt was covered in soot. Chloe's hands looked raw and blistered. The fifth girl, who had barely spoken all night, had a deep burn across her face. The smell of smoke became stronger. Not the gentle smell of a campfire. It was the smell of burning cloth, melted plastic, and something far worse. For a second, the clearing disappeared. In its place stood a cabin filled with flames. Smoke rolled across the ceiling. The girls screamed and pushed against a door that would not open. Orange light filled the room. A window shattered, and heat rushed over them like an invisible wave. Amber saw herself kneeling beside a burning bed. She remembered the cigarette. She remembered dropping it when someone laughed outside. She remembered hiding the packet beneath her mattress. She remembered waking to smoke. She remembered Sally shouting her name. She remembered realizing what she had done. Then, Amber blinked. The clearing returned. Her clothes were clean again. Her skin was smooth. The fire burned quietly in front of her. Amber stared at Claire. "You are crazy," she whispered. Claire closed her eyes. "Amber, please. You are a crazy old woman," Amber shouted, just like everyone said. "You make up things because no one likes you. I am trying to help you. We do not need help. You have to remember. No, you have to let go. No." Claire took another step forward. "You do not have to stay here. None of you do. The fire was 40 years ago. It ended. You can stop repeating this night." Amber turned away from her. "Do not listen to her," she told the others. Sally hesitated. For one moment, she looked at Claire with an expression of deep fear and understanding. "I remember smoke," Sally whispered. Amber grabbed her hand. "No, you do not. I remember trying to wake you. You had a nightmare. I remember the door." Amber squeezed her hand harder. "No," Sally looked down at their joined hands. Ash appeared between their fingers. She gasped and pulled away. Claire reached toward her. "Sally, you can leave." Amber stepped between them. "She is lying." "Why would I lie?" Claire asked. "Because you hate us." "I did hate you for a long time," Claire admitted. "I hated all of you. I hated the way you treated me. I hated Amber for starting the fire. I hated the counselors for not reaching you sooner. I hated myself because I survived." The girls became quiet. Claire wiped her face. "For years, I wished I had done more," she said. "I wondered if I could have broken the window or climbed through the back. I wondered if I had shouted sooner, maybe someone could have saved you." "It was not your fault," Sally whispered. Claire looked at her, surprised. Sally's face softened. Smoke moved behind her eyes like a distant memory. "It was not your fault," she repeated. A pale light appeared around Sally's body. Amber turned to her in panic. "What are you doing?" Sally looked toward the dark trees. Somewhere beyond them, a soft glow had appeared between the trunks. "I think I hear my mother," Sally said. "There is no one there," Amber replied. "I have not heard her voice in so long. You are imagining it." Sally stepped away from the fire. Amber grabbed her wrist. "Do not leave." Sally looked back at her. "You left the cigarette burning." Amber froze. The other girls stared at her. "I did not mean to," Amber said. Her voice sounded younger now, not like the confident storyteller who had begun the evening, but like a frightened child. "I thought I put it out." "You told us it was safe," Chloe said. "I did not know." "You locked the door," Tamara whispered. Amber turned toward her. What? You locked it because you did not want the counselor to catch us. Amber's eyes widened. No, I only pushed the chair against it. That is why we could not get out, Chloe said. I was scared. So were we. The clearing began to change again. The log benches became burned boards. The campfire stones sank beneath weeds and moss. The bright flames turned into small red embers. Through the trees, the cabins looked old, repaired, and different from the ones the girls remembered. Claire watched as the truth slowly reached them. You can leave, she said. You only have to stop pretending. Sally took another step toward the light in the trees. Tamara followed her. Chloe began to move as well, though she was crying. Amber stood beside the dying fire. Do not go, she begged. Sally looked back. You can come with us. Amber shook her head. I cannot. Yes, you can, Claire said. Amber looked at her. What happens after? I do not know. What if they hate me? Who? The others. Their families. Everyone. Claire's expression softened. You were a child. You made a terrible choice, but you have punished yourself for 40 years. Amber looked down at the ground. I killed them. You caused the fire, Claire said, but keeping them trapped here will not change what happened. I did not keep them here. They stayed because you kept telling the story, Claire replied. You changed the truth. You made yourself believe I disappeared. You made them believe the fire never happened. Amber looked toward the others. They stood near the trees, their bodies becoming pale and transparent in the soft light. I was afraid to be alone, Amber said. Sally reached out her hand. You do not have to be. Amber took one step toward her. Then a flashlight beam cut through the clearing. Claire? The light passed across the trees, the ground, and the old fire pit. A group of young campers stood several yards away. They wore modern camp shirts and carried flashlights. Their counselors stood behind them, looking confused. To their eyes, Claire was alone. The clearing was empty except for weeds, moss, and the cold remains of a fire pit that had not been used in decades. No girls sat on the benches because the benches had long ago rotted away. There was no fire. There were no marshmallow bags or bright camp shirts. Only Claire stood in the darkness, speaking to an empty space. One of the young campers stepped closer. Claire, who are you talking to? Claire turned toward them. When she looked back, Sally, Tamara, and Chloe were gone. The light between the trees had disappeared. Only Amber remained beside the old fire pit. Her pink shirt was burned black. Ash covered her skin. Her eyes were wide and empty. She looked at Claire with a small, frightened smile. Maybe next summer, Amber whispered. Claire's heart sank. Amber, please. But the clearing was already fading from Claire's sight. The dead fire returned to the way the living campers saw it. Weeds covered the stones. Silence filled the woods. Claire wiped the tears from her face. Nobody, girls, she told the campers. I was just talking to some people I used to know. The younger campers exchanged uncertain looks. Are you okay? One of them asked. Claire forced a small smile. I will be. She led them away from the clearing, back toward the cabins and their warm lights. The girls talked quietly as they walked, but Claire did not hear what they were saying. Behind her, the woods remained dark. For several moments, there was nothing but the sound of crickets and the soft movement of pine branches in the wind. Then, a faint laugh drifted through the trees. It was the laugh of a 13-year-old girl, bright and playful, as if nothing terrible had ever happened. A moment later, Amber's voice rose from the empty clearing. Do you guys want to hear the real story about this camp? Other voices answered her, distant and excited. The ghostly fire came alive once more, unseen by the living. And somewhere in the darkness, Amber began her story again. Once upon a time, she whispered, there was a girl who never left. Story 2. Mark had always liked living alone. His apartment was on the 12th floor of an old building in Brooklyn, high enough above the street that most of the city noise reached him as a soft, distant hum. During the day, he could hear car horns, construction work, and people shouting on the sidewalks below. At night, however, those sounds slowly disappeared until his apartment felt separated from the rest of the world. The place was larger than he needed. It had a wide living room, a narrow kitchen, a small office, and a bedroom with tall windows facing the city. Mark had lived there for almost 4 years, and in all that time, he had never felt uncomfortable. The building was old, and its pipes knocked inside the walls during cold weather, but he was used to it. The floorboards sometimes creaked without anyone walking on them, but he blamed the age of the wood. Every strange sound had a reasonable explanation. That changed 1 week ago. Mark had spent Saturday morning walking through a flea market several blocks from his apartment. He had not gone there looking for anything special. He often visited flea markets when he had nothing else to do. He enjoyed searching through old books, broken radios, dusty paintings, and boxes, filled with objects that once belonged to strangers. Near the far end of the market, beneath a faded green tent, Mark noticed a large object covered by a dark sheet. It stood taller than everything around it. The shape looked almost like a doorway. An old man sat beside it in a folding chair. He wore a brown coat, even though the weather was warm. His face was thin, and one of his eyes appeared cloudy. When Mark stopped in front of the covered object, the old man looked up at him without smiling. "What's under there?" Mark asked. The man stared at him for several seconds before answering. "A mirror." Mark reached for the sheet, but the old man suddenly lifted one hand. "Careful." Mark paused. "Is it broken?" "No, then what should I be careful about?" The old man did not answer. He slowly lowered his hand and looked away. Mark pulled the sheet aside. The mirror was enormous. It stood more than 7 feet tall and was surrounded by a thick oak frame carved with twisting leaves and small flowers. The wood was dark from age, and thin cracks ran along its surface. The glass itself looked strange. It was not bright and clear like a modern mirror. It had a dark, smoky color, as if something had stained it from behind. Even in the sunlight, Mark could barely see his full reflection. Still, he liked it. His bedroom had an empty corner, and he had recently decided that the room needed something old and unusual. The mirror seemed perfect. It looked expensive, though it was covered in dust. "How much?" Mark asked. The old man gave him a price so low that Mark thought he had misunderstood. "That's all?" The man nodded. "Does it come apart?" "I'm not sure I can carry it." "No. Do you deliver?" The old man looked at the mirror and then back at Mark. "You take it today, and it's yours." There was something uncomfortable in his voice, as if he was not selling the mirror, but trying to get rid of it. Mark should have noticed that. He should have asked where the mirror came from or why it was so cheap. Instead, he paid the man. It took Mark, 2 workers from the market, and a borrowed van to move the mirror. They wrapped it in thick blankets and tied it with rope. Even with 3 men carrying it, the thing felt far heavier than it should have been. One of the workers nearly dropped his side while they were taking it through the apartment building. "What is this made of?" the man complained. "Concrete?" Mark laughed. "It's just old wood and glass." The worker did not laugh back. He glanced at the covered mirror and wiped sweat from his forehead. When they finally placed it in the corner of Mark's bedroom, the mirror stood so tall that the top of the frame almost touched the ceiling. Mark paid the workers, closed the apartment door behind them, and removed the blankets. For the first few hours, he was pleased with it. The mirror made the bedroom look larger. Its old frame gave the room a dark, expensive style. Mark cleaned the glass with a cloth, but the smoky color remained. There were small marks inside it that could not be wiped away. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the buildings, Mark noticed that the mirror seemed darker than before. His reflection was still visible, but the bedroom behind him looked deeper inside the glass, almost as if the mirror showed another room rather than a simple reflection. He blamed the poor light. For the first 2 nights, nothing happened. On the 3rd night, Mark went to bed shortly after midnight. He had been working late for several days and was exhausted. He changed his clothes, turned off the bedroom light, and climbed beneath the blankets. The mirror stood in the corner behind him. Mark usually slept facing the wall. Just before closing his eyes, he shifted onto his side and caught sight of his reflection from the corner of his vision. He saw himself lying on the bed. Then he turned his face toward the wall. His reflection remained still, only for a second. A moment later, the figure inside the mirror turned its head too. Mark opened his eyes. He stayed completely still, listening to his own breathing. His heart had begun to beat faster, but he told himself that he had imagined it. He was tired. The room was dark. The reflection had probably moved at the same time, and his eyes had simply failed to follow it. Slowly, he looked back at the mirror. His reflection was lying exactly as he was. Mark watched it for nearly a minute. It did not move on its own. Feeling foolish, he turned back toward the wall and forced himself to sleep. The next morning, he remembered the strange moment, but did not take it seriously. He laughed about it while making coffee. He had been working too much, and lack of sleep could make anyone see things. During the day, the mirror behaved normally. Mark stood in front of it several times, moving his arms quickly and turning his head from side to side. The reflection copied him perfectly. There was no delay. By evening, Mark had almost forgotten the incident. The next night was different. He woke suddenly in complete darkness. At first, he did not know what had disturbed him. His apartment was silent. The traffic far below had nearly stopped. No pipes knocked in the walls. No footsteps passed through the hallway outside. Then, he heard a soft, rustling sound. It came from the bedroom. The sound was faint, like fabric moving against fabric. Mark opened his eyes. A pale green light from the digital clock rested on the wall beside his bed. The numbers read 3:14 a.m. Mark was lying flat on his back. The rustling stopped. He turned his eyes toward the mirror without moving his head. His reflection was not lying down. Inside the glass, the other Mark was sitting upright on the edge of the bed. Its back was straight. Its hands rested on its knees. Its face was turned toward the real Mark. It was watching him. Mark could not breathe. The figure inside the mirror looked exactly like him, but its eyes were too wide. They seemed fully awake, bright and living in the darkness. Its expression was empty, yet there was something hungry in the way it stared. Mark tried to sit up, but his body felt frozen. For several seconds, he could not move his arms or legs. He wondered if he was trapped in sleep paralysis. He had read about it before. People woke up unable to move and sometimes saw figures standing near their beds. That had to be the explanation. Then the reflection smiled. It was a small smile at first. The corners of its mouth slowly lifted. Mark found his voice and screamed. The moment he screamed, he was able to move again. He threw himself out of bed and switched on the light. The reflection was standing in the same position as him. There was no smile. Mark did not sleep again that night. The next morning, he covered the mirror with a blanket. He called in sick to work and spent most of the day sitting in the living room. Every few minutes, he looked toward the bedroom door. He considered throwing the mirror away, but he could not stop thinking about how heavy it had been. He doubted he could move it alone. Still, by afternoon, his fear had turned into anger. It was only a mirror. There had to be a problem with the glass or the angle. Maybe headlights from the street had created the illusion of movement. Perhaps he had dreamed the entire thing. Mark went into the bedroom and pulled the blanket away. His reflection stared back at him normally. He brought a hammer from the kitchen. Standing several feet away, Mark raised it above his shoulder. He hesitated only once before swinging with all his strength. The metal head struck the center of the mirror. Instead of breaking, the glass produced a deep ringing sound. The hammer bounced backward so violently that it flew from Mark's hand and struck the floor. Pain shot through his wrist. He stumbled back, staring at the mirror. There was no crack, not even a scratch. Mark picked up the hammer and tried again. This time, he struck one of the lower corners. The same thing happened. The hammer bounced away as if the mirror were made from solid steel. Mark tried pushing the mirror. He placed both hands against the oak frame and leaned forward with all his weight. It did not move. He pulled from one side. Nothing, he looked behind the frame, expecting to find bolts fixing it to the wall. But there were none. The mirror simply stood on the floor, yet it felt as if it had grown into the building. Mark covered it again before sunset. That night, he slept in the living room with every light turned on. At exactly 3:14 a.m., all the lights went out. Mark woke to the sound of someone walking inside his bedroom. Slow footsteps moved across the wooden floor. One step, then another, then another. Mark sat on the couch, holding the hammer against his chest. The bedroom door was open, but the room beyond it was black. The footsteps stopped. A soft scratching sound began. It came from the mirror. Mark remained awake until sunrise. As soon as daylight entered the apartment, the lights suddenly came back on. That was when Mark called Dan. He did not tell him everything over the phone. He only said that something was wrong and asked Dan to come over that evening. Mark had known Dan since college. Dan was practical, calm, and usually able to find a simple answer to any problem. Mark hoped his friend would look at the mirror and explain what was happening. Dan said he would come after dinner. Mark waited all evening. As the sun went down, the apartment grew darker. Mark did not turn on the lights. He had discovered that the mirror became more active when the bedroom was bright after sunset. In darkness, it remained quieter, although he could sometimes hear breathing from beneath the blanket. By midnight, Dan still had not arrived. Mark called him twice, but Dan did not answer. At 2:48 a.m., someone knocked on the apartment door. Mark almost cried with relief. He rushed into the living room and opened it. Dan stood in the hallway wearing a dark jacket and holding his phone. "Sorry," he said. My car wouldn't start, and then the subway was delayed. Why didn't you answer my texts? Mark had not received any texts. Before he could respond, Dan stepped inside. The apartment was completely dark. Dan stopped just past the doorway. Mark? He called. Why are you sitting in the dark? Why are the lights off? He took another step and reached along the wall, searching for the switch. And what is that? Dan asked, looking toward the bedroom. Wait, is that an old vanity mirror? Where did you dig that up? From the deepest shadow near the bedroom, Mark spoke. His voice was weak and tight with fear. Dan, stay by the door. Dan turned toward him. What? Don't take off your shoes, don't touch the lights, and for God's sake, don't look to the right. Dan gave a nervous laugh. What are you talking about? I asked you not to look at it, Mark whispered. Please, don't look at the mirror. Mark slowly stepped out of the darkness. A small amount of light entered through the living room windows, and Dan finally saw his friend clearly. Mark looked terrible. His skin was pale. Dark circles surrounded his eyes. His hair was dirty and messy, and he had not shaved in several days. His clothes hung loosely from his body, as if he had barely eaten. Dan's expression changed. Jesus, Mark, what happened to you? There's something wrong with it. Mark grabbed the sleeve of Dan's jacket. 3 nights ago, I was going to bed. I turned off the light and faced the wall. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my reflection in the mirror. When I turned away, it didn't move with me. It turned a second later. Dan looked toward the dark bedroom. Your reflection was delayed? Yes, that's not possible. I know. Dan forced a smile. You're overworked. You haven't been sleeping, and now you're seeing things. It was probably an optical illusion. Shadows can do strange things in low light. I thought the same thing. Mark's voice became a thin, broken whisper. But the next night, I woke up at exactly 3:14 a.m. I was lying flat on my back. My reflection was sitting on the edge of the bed. Dan's smile disappeared. It was staring at me, Mark continued. Its eyes were wide open. It was awake, Dan. It was alive. Dan felt a chill crawl across his back, but he tried to ignore it. Okay, he said carefully. That sounds like sleep paralysis. You wake up, but your brain is still partly dreaming. People see things during it. Figures, faces, shadows, it happens. It wasn't paralysis. You said you couldn't move for a few seconds, but after that I could, and it was still there. Dan glanced at the apartment door behind him. Then you need a doctor. During the day, it behaves normally, Mark said. But after the sun goes down, the other Mark inside the glass starts living his own life. The other Mark? That's what it is. Mark pointed toward the bedroom. His hand was shaking badly. I tried to break it with a hammer. The hammer bounced off. I tried to move it, but it won't move. It's not attached to the wall, but it feels like it weighs thousands of pounds. Dan stared at him. Mark, listen to yourself. Don't touch the light. I'm not going to stand here in the dark where you scare yourself. It's almost 3:14. Dan checked the time on his phone. The screen said 3:11 a.m. For the first time, he felt genuinely nervous. Still, Dan refused to believe that a mirror could be dangerous. Mark was exhausted and frightened. The best thing Dan could do was prove that nothing was wrong. He stepped toward the bedroom. Mark grabbed his arm. No, relax, Dan. Please, I'm going to look at it. Don't. Dan pulled free and walked into the bedroom. The mirror stood in the corner, uncovered. Even in the darkness, the glass was visible. It seemed to hold more darkness than the room around it. The oak frame looked almost black. Dan stopped several feet away. At first, he could see only his own shape. Then, his eyes adjusted. His reflection stood in front of him. Mark's reflection stood several feet behind. "See?" Dan said. "There's me and there's you, nothing strange." Mark stayed near the bedroom door. "Come back." Dan leaned closer. The glass looked unusually deep. His own reflection seemed farther away than it should have been, as though another Dan stood inside a room beyond the surface. "Mark, stop it," Dan said. "Look, I'm standing in front of the mirror. There's me. There's you standing behind me." He paused. Something was wrong. Dan looked at Mark's reflection. The real Mark stood behind him with fear frozen on his face. His mouth was slightly open, and his hands were held close to his chest. The reflection did not match him. The Mark inside the mirror was smiling. It was not a normal smile. Its lips stretched slowly toward its ears, opening wider and wider until the skin around its mouth appeared ready to split. Behind those lips were several rows of thin, sharp teeth. Dan could not look away. "Wait," he whispered. "What the hell?" The temperature in the room suddenly dropped. Cold air moved over Dan's skin. His breath became a pale cloud in front of him. "What?" Mark cried. "Dan, what do you see?" Dan's voice shook. "Mark, your reflection is behind me." "I know, it's smiling." Mark began backing away. "You're standing there looking terrified," Dan said. "But the thing in the mirror is smiling. Get away from it." "Its teeth," Dan swallowed. "Why are its teeth so sharp?" A wet screech filled the room. It sounded like metal cutting through meat. The creature inside the mirror slowly raised one hand. The real Mark did not move. The double pressed its fingers against the glass from the other side. The mirror's surface bent outward. Dan stumbled back. The glass rippled like dark liquid. Long black fingernails pushed through the surface, followed by pale fingertips. The fingers entered the real room by several inches, while the rest of the hand remained trapped inside. Dan could hear the nails scratching against the air. "Run!" Mark screamed. "Dan, get out of the apartment." The hand shot through the mirror with impossible speed. It stretched across the room and grabbed Mark by the collar. Mark screamed as he was pulled off his feet. Dan lunged forward and caught Mark's wrist with both hands. The thing in the mirror pulled harder. Mark's body slid across the wooden floor toward the glass. "Don't let go," Mark shouted. Dan planted his feet and pulled with all his strength. The double's arm was far longer than a human arm should have been. It extended from the mirror like a pale rope of flesh, its black claws buried in Mark's clothes. Mark's back struck the oak frame. The glass opened around him. It was no longer solid. Its surface moved like water. Half of Mark's body disappeared into it. Dan tightened his grip. "Dan, grab my hand." Mark screamed. "Run for the door." The room suddenly filled with pressure. Dan's ears popped. The windows shook. The walls seemed to bend inward as if the entire apartment were taking a deep breath. Then there was a deafening crack. It sounded like the air itself had broken. Dan was thrown backward. Mark vanished into the mirror. The surface became solid again. Silence followed. Dan lay on the floor, unable to hear anything except a high ringing in his ears. His chest rose and fell quickly. Pain spread through his shoulder where he had hit the ground. For several seconds, he could not move. Then he slowly sat up. The bedroom was completely dark. "Mark?" No answer. Dan pushed himself to his feet. Mark, where are you? Something moved near the mirror. Soft footsteps crossed the floor. Dan backed toward the living room. A figure stepped out of the darkness. There was a click as someone pressed the light switch. The lights did not turn on. Instead, the wall clock above the apartment door began to spin. Its hands moved backward. They turned faster and faster, racing counterclockwise, while the clock produced a rapid clicking sound. Dan stared at it. The entire apartment felt wrong. The furniture looked slightly different. The couch was on the opposite side of the living room. The kitchen doorway was where the office door should have been. Then, a familiar voice came from the darkness. "I'm here, Dan." It sounded like Mark, but there was a rough, scraping tone beneath it. "Everything is fine," the voice said. "Sorry, it was just a stupid joke." Dan stepped backward until his spine struck the front door. A faint beam of moonlight entered through the window. The figure moved into it. It had Mark's body and Mark's face, but its smile was much too wide. Rows of sharp teeth filled its mouth. Dan reached behind him and grabbed the doorknob. It would not turn. He pulled harder. Nothing happened. The figure took another step. Dan looked down at the lock. The keyhole had always been on the left side of the handle. Now it was on the right. Dan looked around the apartment again. Everything was reversed. The windows, the furniture, the doors, even the pictures on the walls had changed sides. The whole apartment had become a mirror image. The figure moved closer. Its eyes were no longer human. They were hollow and dark, like empty holes cut into its face. Something cold and hungry seemed to watch Dan from deep inside them. "Where are you going, Dan?" the double asked softly. One pale hand reached toward him. Long black claws grew from the ends of its fingers. The clock above the door stopped. The hands rested at 3:14 a.m. The creature tilted its head. Time to go to sleep. Dan tried to scream. Behind the creature, inside the mirror, another shape appeared. The real Mark stood on the other side of the glass. He was trapped in complete darkness. His face was twisted with terror. He slammed both palms against the inside of the mirror again and again. His mouth opened as he screamed for help, but no sound crossed through the glass. Dan saw him. For one brief moment, their eyes met. Then the double stepped between them and blocked Mark from view. Its black claws closed around Dan's throat. Story 3. The sight of tall pine trees rising across the hills had always been tied to my childhood. Even now, whenever I smell wet bark, cold soil, or the sharp scent of pine needles, I am taken back to that place. It is a kind of memory that feels more like a smell than a picture. It is impossible to copy, impossible to replace, and stronger than anything else I have experienced. However, the trees were not what stayed deepest in my mind. It was not the moss covering the rocks or the ferns growing around the roots. It was not the fog that gathered between the trunks or the narrow creek that ran through the valley. What I remembered most was the village, a hidden village filled with people who sounded as if they belonged in an old fairy tale. They played wooden instruments, sending soft whistles through the valleys and across the hills. The sound gave the forest a magical feeling. Whenever I heard it, I felt as though I had stepped into another world, one filled with old secrets and creatures that had been forgotten by everyone except me. As a child, I ran into the woods whenever I had the chance. I would stand at the edge of the trees and wait for the music. The forest in front of me looked like a dark ocean of ancient wood. Fog moved around the bottoms of the tree trunks like water flowing between the posts of a dock. I would cup my hands around my ears and listen carefully. At first, I heard only birds, breaking twigs, rustling leaves, and the wind moving through the branches. Then, without warning, a high note would rise from somewhere deep in the woods. The moment I heard it, my eyes would widen with excitement. My body always moved before my mind had time to think. I would run toward the sound, my small shoes pressing the moss and grass flat beneath me. The wet ground made soft, crushing noises under my feet, like grapes being squeezed. Behind me, the fog would open along the path I had taken, leaving a thin trail that led all the way back toward my house. I never looked back. Someone was waiting for me. The memories of that forest never faded the way normal childhood memories do. Most things from those years became broken pieces over time. Faces blurred. Voices became unclear. Days mixed together until I could no longer remember what happened first. The village was different. Every detail stayed sharp. I could remember the smell of the trees, the cold air touching my cheeks, and the sound of my feet landing on the soft earth. I could remember the exact shape of the fog as it rolled between the trunks. Even the tune from the wooden flute remained inside my mind. Sometimes it seemed as loud as the alarm that woke me for work each morning. As I grew older, I began to miss the village more than I could explain. The memories followed me everywhere. They appeared while I was eating, driving, working, or trying to sleep. I would suddenly remember a house, a face, or a sound, and for a few seconds, the real world around me felt weak and distant. I knew I had to return. I remembered the bridge in the middle of the valley. It was built from twigs, stones, and short pieces of old wood. It crossed a creek so small that it would probably look like a puddle to a grown man. On the other side stood a rusty metal post with a lantern attached to it. The lantern was always burning. Its orange light shone through the fog like a tiny sun, guiding travelers across the creek and toward the hidden path. As a child, I never questioned who lit it or why it never seemed to go out. There was always a small figure waiting near it. He held the wooden flute that played the strange and beautiful tune. He usually stood with his head lowered, his fingers moving quickly across the holes of the instrument. He tapped one foot against the ground in time with the melody, and the notes seemed to travel into the bark of the pine trees. Whenever I reached the bridge, my feet would stop in the wet dirt. The figure would finish the tune and slowly lift his head. The first time I saw his face, I was surprised. But I was not afraid. His head was a hollow gourd. It rested on his shoulders like a mask, with two round holes for eyes and another circle for a mouth. The inside looked dark and empty. At first, I thought the carved shapes could never change. Then, he spoke. "Hello, cousin. I'm so happy to see you again." As he talked, the holes in the gourd shifted and changed shape with every word. His mouth stretched into a smile, and the eye holes narrowed slightly as he laughed. He reached into the pocket of his cotton jacket. It was held together by old bronze buttons, and the sleeves looked too long for his thin arms. He lowered the flute to his side. Where the stem of the gourd should have been, he wore a newsboy cap covered in thick stitching and patches of warm colors. There were pieces of red, orange, brown, and yellow cloth sewn into it. "The town is wide awake today," he told me. "Come on." He waved a hand over his shoulder, urging me to follow. I hurried behind him, excited about whatever adventure waited for me. We crossed the bridge and walked along an ancient cobblestone path covered in moss. A small fence ran along both sides. It had been made from old branches cut and tied together to form rough railings. The fog remained outside the fence. It curled around the wooden posts, but never crossed onto the path. It was as if some invisible wall kept it away, leaving the road clear for us. For years, I struggled to remember the villager's name. It sat somewhere in the back of my mind, hidden under other memories. I knew it sounded old, or perhaps it came from a place I had never heard of. Then, one day, I remembered the label sewn onto his jacket. It was a small piece of white cloth with red stitching. Knox. His name was Knox. As we walked, Knox and I hummed the same tune he had played on the flute. We moved easily through the winding forest until a gate appeared in the distance. It was made from two thick logs standing upright on either side of the path. A rope was tied between them, and a wooden sign hung from the center. Oakenfall. To me, the name shone with the promise of adventure. It felt like the entrance to a world made only for me. Beyond the gate, small houses stood in scattered rows. They came in different shapes, sizes, and colors. Some were round, others narrow, and a few leaned to one side as if they had grown from the ground instead of being built. Their walls were made from stone, covered with plaster, and painted in warm colors. I remember reds, oranges, yellows, and soft shades of brown. None of the houses were blue, purple, or green. I always thought that was strange, though I never cared enough to ask about it. The villagers were much more interesting than the houses. Like Knox, each one had the head of a pumpkin or gourd. Some had smooth orange pumpkins. Others had long pale gourds, small round squash, or dark pumpkins covered in warts. It looked as though someone had thrown every kind of seed into the soil, and instead of plants, a village of people had grown. They were always pleased to see me. Some waved and shouted greetings. Others ran toward me and hugged my leg. The smallest villagers sometimes climbed onto my shoes or held my hands with their soft, leafy fingers. Their excitement made me feel important. It felt as though I were the guest of honor at a great celebration, or the center of their whole world. They never seemed unhappy. I never saw them become angry or jealous. They did not complain, argue, or cry. Even if the rest of the world had been burning, I believe the people of Oakenfall would have continued smiling and laughing. As a child, I saw this as something wonderful. Only later did I wonder if perhaps they had no choice. Maybe they were not happy. Maybe they were cursed to smile. Whenever I visited, they brought me food and drinks unlike anything I had at home. There were warm pies filled with sweet fruit, thick soups, roasted vegetables, cakes covered in honey, and small pastries dusted with sugar. Everything tasted fresh. The smell of bread always filled the air when I entered the town. It drifted from the bakery near the center of Oakenfall, mixing with smoke from chimneys and the scent of fallen leaves. The bakery was the heart of the village. To the people who lived there, it seemed as important as any famous monument in the human world. Life in Oakenfall appeared perfect. The villagers did not fight over greed, anger, or pride because those things seemed not to exist there. Their town was pure and peaceful, like a lake so clean that you could see all the way to the bottom. It seemed like a paradise. However, the villagers did feel one emotion other than happiness: fear. They feared something that lived beyond the village. They spoke about it only in old stories and quiet warnings. According to them, it moved through the forest and came to Oakenfall during certain seasons. When it arrived, it destroyed their crops damaged their houses, and took their people. They spoke of it the way humans talk about the boogeyman or a monster from an old legend. At the time, I did not understand why they were so frightened. I assumed it was some large animal that wandered into the village and ate their crops. Maybe it was a herd of deer. Maybe it was a bear. I even joked that it might eat their pumpkin heads. The villagers laughed when I said this, but their laughter always sounded weaker when the creature was mentioned. The elder of the village claimed he had seen it. He was taller than most of the others and had a long, pale gourd for a head. A crooked wooden staff supported his weight. Deep lines had been carved around the holes of his eyes and mouth, making his face appear ancient. He warned the village whenever he believed the creature was coming. He taught them rituals that were supposed to keep it away. They placed strange symbols around the houses and hung bundles of sticks above their doors. They buried objects in the earth and painted signs on stones near the edge of the town. I witnessed one of their ceremonies. What I saw that night would have disturbed even a soldier who had survived the worst battles of the Great War. All the people of Oakenfall gathered in the center of the village after sunset. They stood around a massive wooden structure built from logs, branches, vines, and dry grass. It had been made in the shape of a man, but the body looked wrong. Its arms were far too long. Its legs were bent and uneven. Its mouth stretched across most of its face. Torches surrounded the structure, filling the village with yellow light. The villagers began to dance around it while singing in a language I did not understand. The song was slow at first. Then it grew faster. I clapped along, unaware of what I was joining or what the words meant. I only knew that everyone around me was moving, and I wanted to be part of it. Eventually, the elder raised his staff. Several villagers stepped forward and touched their torches to the wooden figure. Flames spread quickly from one branch to another. Fire climbed its legs, crossed its chest, and wrapped around its long arms. I thought that was the end of the ritual. Then the statue moved. At first, it only leaned slightly to one side. I believed the wood was collapsing because of the fire. Then it shifted back. Its legs bent. Its long arms lifted into the air. The wooden figure began to dance. The sound of creaking branches mixed with the cracking and popping of the flames. It twisted from side to side in the cold wind, moving like a madman falling through the sky. Its burning arms waved above the villagers. Its mouth opened wider. I knew it was screaming. I could see the shape of the scream in its face, but no voice came from it. The only sounds were breaking wood, roaring fire, and the endless song of the villagers. Their music made me feel safe and uncomfortable at the same time. They jumped to the rhythm and clapped their soft hands. Yellow light reflected from their orange faces, making the center of the village look warm and bright. Beyond the circle, the forest remained black and cold. The shadows of the villagers danced across the surrounding trees. I was proud that they allowed me to witness their ceremony. I believed it meant they trusted me. I believed I was special enough to share their secrets. Whenever I returned home, I tried to tell people about Oakenfall. No one believed me. Most adults barely listened. They were too busy talking about things happening far away. They spoke about wars they had never seen, starvation they had never suffered, and heat in countries they had never visited. They did not care about the magical village hidden in the forest behind our home. To me, Oakenfall was more important than all of those distant places. It was my escape. It was a place where greed, sadness, and cruelty could not enter. I wished other people could see it. When I had just reached double digits, I finally got my chance to prove the village was real. I begged my parents to come into the forest with me. At first, they refused. My mother said she had chores to finish. My father said he was too busy and that the forest was no place for a child to wander alone. I kept asking. When asking did not work, I began to cry. Eventually, my tears changed their minds. They promised to follow me. My sadness disappeared immediately, and I led them through the familiar trees. We walked beneath the old pines as fog gathered around the bark. I hurried ahead, excited to show them the bridge, the lantern, Knox, and the village beyond the gate. When we reached the creek, my excitement began to fade. The bridge was still there, but it looked different. It seemed old and abandoned, as if no one had crossed it for many years. Several twigs were broken. Stones had fallen into the creek. Moss covered the entire surface. The lantern was gone. Without its orange light, the soil on the other side was buried in fog and shadow. I stood still and listened. There was no flute. Only the wind whispered through the maze of trees. It moved from one trunk to another, like a squirrel escaping a predator. My mouth fell open. I could not understand what had happened. A heavy hand came down on my shoulder. "Sorry, buddy," my father said. "It's time to head home." His hand felt like a weight, pushing me into the ground. Each finger seemed to carry his doubt. It was as if he had already decided the village had never existed. A tear rolled down my cheek. My parents turned away and began walking back. For a moment, I remained beside the broken bridge. Then a gust of wind blew from the other side, pressing against my chest like a hand guiding me home. I finally turned to follow them. That was when the music returned. A high, quick tune rose from deep within the forest. I snapped my head back toward the bridge. The flute played louder. My sorrow turned into joy. Without thinking, I ran. My boots struck the path, leaving small footprints in the wet earth. I heard my parents shouting behind me, but their voices became weaker as the music grew stronger. I crossed the bridge and raced along the mossy path. The ancient trees blurred on both sides. The flute seemed to call directly to me. Soon, the old gate of Oakenfall appeared ahead. The wooden sign swung between the two logs. Just before I reached it, the music stopped. The silence was immediate. My feet scraped across the dirt as I came to a sudden stop. I waited for Knox to step from behind one of the posts. I smiled, showing only a small line of teeth. No one appeared. "Knox?" I called. My voice traveled through the gate and disappeared into the fog. "Knox. Is anybody home?" There was no answer. I knew someone had played the flute. Or something had. Something was inside the village. Something was waiting for me. The fog beyond the gate was too thick to see through. I stared into it, trying to find the shapes of houses or villagers. Behind me, my parents' footsteps came closer. Their dark outlines moved between the trees. Then a twig snapped near the gate. I turned quickly. "Knox?" I wanted my friend to appear. Instead, I saw darkness. A huge shadow stood between the two logs, partly hidden by the fog. It was tall and thin, rising higher than any animal I had ever seen. The wind moved around its enormous body as if it were a stone tower in the middle of a storm. At first, I thought it might be a bear. Then I realized a bear would have looked like a mouse beside it. Its size frightened me, but its eyes were worse. Two small lights burned through the fog. They stared directly at me. Their glow entered my mind and marked the creature's shape into my memory like a brand burned into the skin of cattle. They shone brighter than the lantern ever had. My legs weakened. I fell to the ground. Fear covered me so completely that I could barely breathe. I felt as though I were standing before a being from an ancient myth. It seemed older than the forest, older than the hills, older than the human world. Compared to it, I was not even a person. I was a memory it would soon forget. The temperature dropped without warning. The air became painfully cold. My skin dried and tightened, and I felt tiny cracks forming across my hands. Fog twisted around the creature's body. It did not move like normal mist. It formed long coils that wrapped around its arms and legs. Gray clouds spun into small twisters, swallowing the trees, rocks, ferns, grass, and wooden posts. I was thankful that the sunlight behind the creature kept its face hidden in shadow. Even so, I could see the outline. Its face was long. It seemed almost as long as my entire body. I screamed for my parents. Their footsteps grew louder. I did not look away from the creature. Then, two arms grabbed me from behind. My father lifted me from the ground and pulled me back onto the cobblestone path. "What were you thinking?" he shouted. "You can't run away like that. Look," I cried, "at the gate. There's a monster." I pointed toward the enormous shadow. My father turned his head. "Look at it," I begged. "Please, just look." He stared for a moment. "There's nothing there," he said. I could not believe him. My father was an adult. He was wise. He understood things I did not. How could he fail to see something so large? The creature stood before us, like a mountain beside a blade of grass. I turned back and raised my finger with confidence. Then I saw the truth. It was gone. Only the fog remained, spinning in powerful circles between the posts. I gasped for air. It had disappeared in less than a second. Even now, I do not understand how something so huge could vanish so quickly. Its speed, power, and very existence were beyond anything I knew. It frightened me more than human weapons, more than disease, more than death itself. That day felt like the beginning of something new, or perhaps it was the return of something ancient that had been sleeping for a very long time. The creature's eyes followed me into my dreams. For years, I saw them in dark rooms and empty corners. I imagined them watching from behind trees, through windows, and across fields. Whenever fog rolled into town, I thought of it. The mist moved through streets like floodwater, curling around buildings and swallowing everything people had built on land that had never truly belonged to them. When the wind grew strong, the trees cracked and twisted their branches into frantic shapes. I felt as if the world around me were slowly drowning in the creature's darkness. There was nothing I could do. I was like a stone trying to fight against the current of a river, only to be worn down until nothing remained but a grain of sand. My eyes had cursed me with knowledge. I had seen the creature. I knew its size. I knew its power. I knew its eyes. No one else understood. No one else believed. I was the only person who knew a monster waited in the forest near the village of Oakenfall. As the years passed, I changed. My body grew taller. My face gained lines. My life filled with memories, work, bills, and responsibilities. The valley no longer seemed important. I was not 10 years old anymore. Eventually, I convinced myself that the creature had never existed. Perhaps Oakenfall itself had only been part of my imagination. Children create worlds to escape loneliness. They turn branches into swords, stones into treasure, and sounds in the forest into music. Maybe I had invented knocks. Maybe I had imagined the villagers because I wanted friends. The burning statue, the smiling pumpkin faces, and the monster at the gate could all have been pieces of a dream that I had mistaken for reality. By the time I reached my teenage years, I almost believed this explanation. As an adult, I repeated it whenever the old memories returned. It was only a childhood fantasy. It was only fear. It was only fog and shadows. For many years, that explanation was enough. Then, on an ordinary day, everything changed. I was standing near a window when the wind began to move through the trees outside. At first, I paid no attention. Then, a thin, high note rose from the belly of the forest. My entire body became still. A second note followed. Then, a third. The tune was old, playful, and impossible to forget. It was the same wooden flute, the same melody Knox had once played for me. After all those years, Oakenfall was calling me home. Story 4. Amelia was sitting beside her husband again, close to the quiet shore under a wide, dark sky. Thousands of stars shone above them, scattered across the night like tiny pieces of broken glass. The moon was thin and pale, almost hidden behind slow-moving clouds. A cool wind came from the ocean and brushed gently across Amelia's face, carrying the smell of salt, smoke, and wet sand. It was the kind of night she and Bobby had always loved. They were sitting in their usual place, a quiet corner of the beach, far away from the roads, hotels, and crowded restaurants. Most people did not come this far because the path was difficult to find. It passed through a line of trees, over a small hill, and down a narrow trail covered with loose stones. But Amelia and Bobby knew the way well. They had been coming to this exact spot for years. It was their place. They had first discovered it when they were still dating. Back then, Bobby had brought an old blanket, a bag of marshmallows, and a cheap bottle of wine. Amelia had laughed because he had forgotten to bring glasses. They ended up drinking straight from the bottle while sitting beside a small campfire. They talked until sunrise and promised each other that they would return whenever life became too loud. And they had kept that promise. They came after difficult weeks at work. They came after arguments. They came on birthdays, anniversaries, and ordinary weekends when neither of them had anything better to do. Sometimes they brought food. Sometimes they brought music. Sometimes they simply sat together in silence and listened to the waves. The beach had witnessed almost every part of their relationship. It was where Bobby had first told Amelia that he loved her. It was where he had asked her to marry him, kneeling in the wet sand while she cried and laughed at the same time. It was also where they came after losing their first child, when neither of them knew what to say. Bobby had held her until morning while the ocean roared in the darkness. That night, however, was peaceful. The campfire burned brightly in front of them, sending warm sparks into the air. The flames twisted around pieces of wood, making soft cracking sounds. Amelia sat with her knees pulled close to her chest. A thick blanket was wrapped around her shoulders. Bobby sat beside her, staring toward the ocean. The waves rolled slowly toward the shore and disappeared into the sand. There was no one else around. That was one of the reasons they loved the place so much. They did not have to hear strangers laughing, children screaming, or music playing from nearby cars. No one interrupted them. No one asked questions. No one watched them. The entire beach belonged to them. Amelia looked at Bobby and smiled. The light from the fire moved across his face, making his features appear softer. He looked calm, almost lost in thought. His dark hair moved slightly in the wind. His eyes reflected the orange flames. "What are you thinking about?" Amelia asked. Bobby turned toward her. "Nothing important," he said. "That means you're thinking about something very important." He smiled, but did not answer. Amelia leaned closer and rested her head on his shoulder. Bobby placed one arm around her. For a while, neither of them spoke. Amelia closed her eyes. She listened to the fire, the waves, and Bobby's slow breathing. She felt safe there, safer than she had felt in weeks. Work had been stressful. Her mother had been calling almost every day. The house needed repairs, and money was tighter than usual. But none of those things seemed important on the beach. There, the world felt far away. Bobby kissed the top of her head. Amelia smiled. "You're quiet tonight," she said. "So are you. I'm enjoying it." "Me too." She opened her eyes and looked at the stars. "Do you remember the first time we came here?" Bobby nodded. "You forgot the glasses. I was nervous. You also forgot the matches. I found a lighter. You borrowed one from that fisherman. He wasn't using it." Amelia laughed. Bobby laughed too, though his laughter sounded strangely low. She did not think much about it. The wind became colder, and Amelia pulled the blanket more tightly around herself. Bobby stood up and walked toward the fire. He moved one of the burning logs with a long piece of wood, then added another branch. For a moment, Amelia watched his back. Something about the scene felt familiar, like a memory she had experienced many times before. The black water. The fire. Bobby standing in front of it. The wind moving through his coat. She felt a sudden sadness without knowing why. "Are you okay?" Bobby asked, still facing the fire. "Yes," she said. "I was just thinking." "About what?" Amelia hesitated. She could not explain the feeling. It was heavy but distant, like a storm forming somewhere beyond the horizon. "Nothing important," she said. Bobby turned and looked at her. "That means you're thinking about something very important." He repeated the same words she had said to him earlier. Amelia smiled. "Maybe." Bobby walked back and sat beside her again. For several minutes, they watched the waves in silence. Then, Bobby stood. "I'm going to get more wood," he said. "There's plenty. The fire will die before midnight." Amelia looked at the pile beside them. He was right. There were only a few pieces left. "Don't go far," she said. Bobby gave her a playful smile. "Afraid of being alone?" "No. Are you sure?" "Yes." He leaned down and kissed her forehead. "I'll be back in a minute." Amelia watched him walk away from the fire. His body slowly disappeared into the darkness near the line of trees. She could hear his footsteps for a few seconds before the sound faded. She turned back toward the ocean. The beach seemed different without him beside her. The darkness felt deeper. The sound of the waves felt louder. Even the fire seemed smaller. Amelia pulled the blanket around herself and stared into the flames. She reminded herself that Bobby was only a short distance away. He had walked through those trees many times. There was nothing dangerous there. Still, she felt uneasy. A cold feeling passed through her stomach. She looked over her shoulder. The trail behind her was empty. The trees moved gently in the wind, their branches scratching against one another. "Bobby?" She called. No answer came. Amelia waited. He had probably not heard her. She turned back toward the fire. A moment later, she felt two hands cover her eyes. Amelia jumped, then immediately began to laugh. The sudden touch had frightened her, but she knew exactly what Bobby was doing. It was one of their little games. He had done it many times before. He would sneak up behind her, cover her eyes, and refuse to let go until she guessed who he was. The game was silly because the answer was always obvious. Amelia smiled and reached up, placing her fingers against the hands covering her face. "It's you, little bear," she said. "It's you, Bobby," no one answered. Amelia giggled. "Bobby, I guessed. I know it's you." The hands remained over her eyes. She tapped them playfully. "You're supposed to say something." Still, there was no answer. The fire cracked in front of her. A wave broke against the shore. Amelia's smile slowly faded. Something about the hands felt wrong. Bobby's hands were large and warm. She knew every part of them. She knew the rough skin on his palms from years of working with tools. She knew the small scar near his right thumb. She knew the way his fingers curved around hers when they walked together. The hands covering her eyes were different. They were cold. The fingers were long and thin. The skin felt strangely smooth, almost wet. There was no scar on the thumb. There were no rough places on the palms. Amelia's body became stiff. "Bobby?" she whispered. The hands moved slightly. Their fingertips slowly caressed her skin. One finger traced the curve beneath her left eye. Another moved across her eyebrow. The touch was gentle, but it did not feel loving. It felt curious. It felt as if something was studying her face. Amelia tried to laugh again, but the sound came out weak and nervous. "All right," she said. "The game is over. Bobby, you can let go now." No answer. The hands continued touching her. Amelia could hear breathing behind her. It was slow and deep. She held her own breath and listened. The breathing did not sound like Bobby's. It was too heavy, too wet. Each breath ended with a faint clicking sound, as if something inside the throat was moving. Fear began to rise inside Amelia. She tried to tell herself that Bobby was only trying to scare her. Maybe he had dipped his hands in cold water. Maybe he was changing his voice or breathing differently to make the game more convincing. But the thought did not comfort her. "Bobby," she said again, "please stop." The hands pressed more firmly against her face. Amelia's heart began beating faster. She tried to pull the hands away, but they did not move. Their grip was much stronger than she had expected. She grabbed the wrists and pulled, but they felt hard and stiff beneath the skin. "Bobby, it isn't funny." Silence. The pressure increased. Amelia cried out. The fingers pushed against her eyelids. Pain spread through her face and into her head. She twisted her body and tried to stand, but something behind her forced her back down. "Stop." The hands pressed harder. Amelia screamed. The sound traveled across the empty beach, but no one came. The waves continued moving. The fire continued burning. The stars remained cold and distant above her. "Bobby." There was still no answer. The fingers dug deeper into her skin. Sharp nails scratched the sides of her face. Warm blood began running down her cheeks. Amelia felt it mix with her tears. She kicked at the sand and threw her arms backward, trying to hit whoever was behind her. Her hands touched nothing. She could feel the hands on her face, but she could not feel a body behind them. That frightened her more than the pain. "Please," she begged. "Please, let me go." The hands did not care. They held her with calm, terrible strength. It felt as if they were not trying to frighten her. It felt as if they were claiming her eyes, taking them, testing how easily they could be removed. The fingers pressed into the soft places around her eyelids. A bright flash of pain exploded inside Amelia's head. She screamed until her throat burned. Her nails dug into the wrists again, but the skin felt loose and unnatural. For one terrible second, Amelia thought she felt something moving beneath it, like insects crawling under a thin sheet. She pulled her hands away, in horror. Bobby. She screamed again. The name echoed across the beach. This time, somewhere near the fire, she heard a soft laugh. Amelia froze. The laugh had come from in front of her, but the hands were still covering her eyes from behind. Her breathing became wild and uneven. "Who are you?" she whispered. The pressure suddenly stopped. The hands became gentle again. One thumb wiped a tear from her cheek. A finger traced the blood running along her jaw. Then a voice whispered close to her ear. "You guessed wrong." The voice sounded like Bobby's, but there was something hidden beneath it. Another voice seemed to speak at the same time, lower and rougher, repeating the words half a second later. "You guessed wrong." Amelia tried to turn around. The hands pressed once more, harder than before. Pain tore through her face. She felt one nail slide beneath her eyelid. "No," she screamed. "No, please." The fire cracked loudly. The hands suddenly released her. Amelia fell forward onto the sand. She immediately covered her face and cried. Her eyes burned so badly that she could barely open them. Blood ran from several deep scratches around her cheeks and forehead. Her whole body shook. For several seconds, she stayed on the ground. She expected the hands to return. She expected fingers to grab her hair or close around her throat. But nothing touched her. The only sounds were the ocean and the campfire. Slowly, Amelia lifted her head. Her vision was blurred by tears, but she forced her eyes open. The flames moved in front of her, spreading orange light across the sand. She looked to her left. No one was there. She looked to her right. The beach was empty. She turned around quickly. There was nothing behind her. No footprints. No figure running into the trees. No shadow moving through the darkness. The sand directly behind her was smooth and untouched. Amelia struggled to stand. Her knees were weak, and she almost fell again. She wiped blood from her face and looked toward the trees. "Bobby?" she called. Her voice sounded small and broken. No one answered from the darkness. Then she heard wood crack inside the fire. Amelia slowly turned toward it. Bobby was sitting on the other side of the flames. She stared at him. He was sitting in the same place he had been before he went to collect wood. His body was relaxed, and his hands rested on his knees. The firelight moved across his face. Amelia could not understand how he had gotten there without her hearing him. "Bobby?" He looked at her. He was smiling. Relief rushed through Amelia for one brief moment. She stumbled toward him. "Oh my God," she said. "Something was behind me. Someone grabbed me. They covered my eyes," and she stopped. Bobby did not move. His smile remained fixed on his face. It was the same smile he always wore when they played the guessing game and Amelia gave the wrong answer. A wide, playful smile, usually followed by laughter. But now, it looked different. Too wide. Too still. His lips were stretched tightly across his teeth. His eyes did not match the expression. They were dark and empty. reflecting no light from the fire. Amelia took one step backward. Bobby? He tilted his head. The movement was slow and unnatural, as if his neck had become stiff. Amelia looked at his hands. They were resting on his knees. They were large, warm-looking hands with rough palms. The familiar scar was near his right thumb. They were Bobby's hands. The hands that had covered Amelia's eyes were not. She stared at him, breathing heavily. "Who was behind me?" she asked. Bobby continued smiling. "Where did you go?" No answer. "You said you were getting wood." Bobby lifted one hand and pointed beside the fire. The pile of wood was full. Dozens of dry branches were stacked neatly together. Amelia stared at them. She did not remember seeing that much wood before. "When did you bring that back?" she asked. Bobby slowly lowered his hand. His smile grew wider. Amelia's fear returned. She wanted to run, but her legs would not move. She could feel blood drying on her face. Her eyes continued to burn. Every part of her body told her to get away from the fire and leave the beach. But she could not stop looking at her husband. Something was wrong with him. Something had been wrong from the beginning. She remembered the way he had laughed earlier. She remembered the distant look in his eyes. She remembered the sadness that had come over her when she watched him standing by the flames. Then another memory entered her mind. It was not a complete memory. It was only a flash. A hospital room. White walls. A doctor speaking softly. Amelia sitting alone. She blinked. The beach returned. Bobby was still smiling. Amelia shook her head. "No," she whispered. Another memory appeared. Rain hitting a car window. Red and blue lights flashing in the night. Broken glass on the road. A body covered with a white sheet. Amelia pressed both hands against her temples. No, Bobby's smile did not change. She remembered standing at a funeral. She remembered wearing a black dress. She remembered holding a small wooden box while people spoke to her in quiet, careful voices. She remembered returning home alone. She remembered staring at Bobby's empty side of the bed. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. The truth entered her mind slowly, like cold water rising around her body. Bobby had not come to the beach with her. Bobby had not been alive for 11 months. He had died in a car accident on a rainy night while driving home from work. Amelia had spread his ashes on this beach. She had done it in the exact place where they now sat. The wooden box had felt too light in her hands. She had opened it near the water and watched the gray ashes disappear into the wind. Afterward, she had returned to the beach again and again. Sometimes she spoke to him. Sometimes she imagined him sitting beside her. But she had never seen him this clearly before. "Bobby," she whispered. The thing beside the fire leaned forward. Its smile stretched beyond the natural corners of Bobby's mouth. The skin around its lips began to split. Amelia stepped backward. "You're not him." The thing's head tilted farther to one side. A soft cracking sound came from its neck. Amelia began shaking her head. "You're not Bobby." The fire suddenly grew brighter. For a moment, she saw long shadows moving behind the thing. They did not match its body. They looked like thin arms reaching outward, each ending in narrow fingers. Amelia turned and ran. She did not stop to take the blanket, her bag, or her shoes. She ran barefoot across the cold sand, blood still running down her face. Behind her, she heard laughter. It sounded like Bobby. Then it sounded like something else. The laughter followed her all the way toward the trees. Amelia reached the narrow path and climbed as quickly as she could. Stones cut into her feet, and branches scratched her arms. She did not look back. Halfway up the trail, she heard footsteps behind her. Slow footsteps. They did not run. They did not need to. Each time Amelia looked over her shoulder, the path was empty. But whenever she faced forward, she heard the steps again. Crunch, crunch, crunch. She reached the top of the hill and saw her car parked near the road. Amelia ran toward it and pulled at the door. Locked. Her keys were still inside her bag beside the campfire. No, she whispered. The footsteps stopped behind her. Amelia slowly turned. The road was empty. The trail was dark. For a moment, she thought she had escaped. Then, two cold hands covered her eyes. Amelia froze. A familiar voice whispered beside her ear. Guess who? Story 5. I was 12 years old the first time I saw my mother smile after my father died. It was not a happy smile. It was not the kind of smile that meant she was healing or finally learning how to live without him. It was the smile of someone who had found a way out of a problem that had been slowly crushing her. The problem was me. That sounds harsh, but I do not blame her. After my father died, my mother had to work 2 jobs just to keep our small house and put food on the table. She worked double shifts at a hospital laundry service, sometimes leaving before sunrise and returning long after dark. During the school year, I spent most afternoons at a neighbor's house. But summer was coming, and our neighbor had already told my mother she would be visiting family in another state. My mother could not afford daycare. She could not leave me alone for 12 hours every day. She had no family nearby, and no one else she trusted. One evening, I found her sitting at the kitchen table with her face buried in her hands. A pile of unpaid bills lay in front of her. The kitchen light was off, and the last orange glow of sunset came through the window behind her. I stood in the doorway for a while without saying anything. She did not notice me. Her shoulders moved as she cried quietly. The next morning, everything had changed. She was standing in the kitchen, making eggs when I came downstairs. Her eyes were still swollen, but she was smiling. "I found a place for you," she said. I sat down at the table. "What place?" "A summer retreat." I stared at her. My family had always been deeply Catholic. We prayed before every meal. We attended church every Sunday and Wednesday. My father had made me memorize prayers before I was old enough to understand what they meant. Every mistake was a sin. Every bad thought required repentance. Every difficult moment was part of God's plan. So when my mother told me that she had found a religious summer camp, it did not seem strange at first. "It's called St. Gabriel's Summer Retreat," she said. "It's completely free." "Free?" She nodded quickly. Transportation, food, lodging, everything. I remember thinking it sounded too good to be true, but I was 12. I was more interested in the pictures she described. Swimming, fishing, hiking, campfires, canoeing, and cabins near a lake. "It'll be good for you," she said. "I think it'll help." Help with what? She did not say. She'd probably meant my grief. After my father died, I stopped spending time with friends. I did not want to play outside anymore. I had nightmares almost every night. Sometimes I woke up expecting to hear his footsteps in the hallway. I asked my mother how she had heard about the camp. She looked confused for a moment. Then she said someone from church must have told her. That answer made sense at the time. Years later, when I asked her again, She could not remember. There had been no website, no brochure, no advertisement in the newspaper, no announcement at church, no phone number written on the refrigerator, no application form. One day, the camp did not exist. The next day, my mother knew exactly when the bus would arrive. A week later, I stood beside her in the parking lot of an old grocery store before sunrise. I carried one suitcase, a sleeping bag, and a paper bag filled with snacks for the ride. The bus arrived at 6 in the morning. It looked older than any school bus I had ever seen. Its paint was faded, and there was no company name on the side. The only symbol was a small golden cross near the front door. An elderly man sat behind the wheel. He had thin, white hair and deep lines around his mouth. He did not introduce himself. He only checked my name on a clipboard and told me to find a seat. My mother hugged me tightly before I climbed aboard. For a second, I thought she might change her mind. Instead, she whispered, "This is going to be good for both of us." There were already 3 children on the bus. By the time we finished picking everyone up, there were 8 of us. We came from different towns, but we all had something in common. At the time, I did not understand what it was. Toby was a thin boy with red hair and freckles. Both of his parents had died in a house fire. He had survived because he had been sleeping at his grandmother's house. Carly was a quiet girl with long brown hair. Her older brother had disappeared while walking home from school. No body had ever been found. Jen's father was in prison, and her mother had died from an overdose. Mac had lost his younger sister to an illness. Nathan had watched his father die during a robbery. Drew's parents had been killed in a car accident. The final boy was named Mitch. He barely spoke. His mother had died in a crash only a few months earlier. He stared out the window for most of the ride, holding an old photograph against his chest. The driver appointed Mitch as our bus leader. He said it casually, like it was a reward. "You're responsible for keeping everyone calm," the driver told him. "Make sure nobody gets left behind." Mitch nodded without looking up. At 12 years old, I did not realize that trauma was the only requirement for admission. I thought we were simply a group of unlucky children being given a free vacation. The trip lasted almost 7 hours. At first, we followed busy highways. Then the towns became smaller and farther apart. The highway turned into a narrow paved road. The paved road became gravel. Eventually, our phones lost their signal. The forests grew thicker around us. Tall trees leaned over the road, their branches blocking most of the sky. By late afternoon, even the sunlight had trouble reaching the ground. The children slowly stopped talking. The driver stopped answering questions. The only sound was the low engine and the tires rolling over loose stones. As the sun began to set, I felt a pressure in my ears, like we had climbed a mountain. I looked out the window and saw nothing but trees. Then, without warning, the forest opened. A wide clearing appeared ahead of us. St. Gabriel's summer retreat stood in the center of it. It did not look like a summer camp. It looked like a monastery that had been hidden from the world. Several large gray stone buildings surrounded a beautiful garden. A tall bell tower rose above the trees. Beyond the buildings was a lake so calm that it reflected the evening sky like a mirror. There were flower beds, stone paths, wooden cabins, and carefully cut grass. Everything looked old, but nothing looked damaged. There were no broken windows, no cracked walls, no weeds. The place seemed perfectly preserved. It was beautiful, too beautiful. It looked less like something that had been built and more like something that had been waiting. A priest stood beside the road as the bus approached. He was already walking toward us before the driver stopped. The bus doors opened, and he climbed aboard. He looked to be in his 60s. His skin was wrinkled, and his hair was completely white. He had kind eyes and a soft smile. "Welcome home," he said. The other children smiled. Something about the word home made my stomach tighten. The priest introduced himself as Father Thomas. He spoke gently and told us that St. Gabriel's was a place for healing. He said we were safe there. He said we would make friends, enjoy nature, and leave our sadness behind. For the first 2 days, everything was perfect. We went fishing in the morning and swimming in the afternoon. We hiked through the woods, made crafts, and paddled canoes across the lake. At night, we sat around a large fire while the counselors told stories. The counselors never raised their voices. Nobody was bullied. The food was homemade and warm. We ate fresh bread, soup, roasted chicken, vegetables, pies, and cakes. There was always enough for seconds. The cabins were clean, the beds were soft, the showers had hot water. Looking back, those first 2 days may have been the happiest I had felt since my father died. That was probably the point. Happiness makes it easier to ignore things. Small things. Things that feel wrong but are easy to explain away. The first thing I noticed was the chapel. It stood near the center of the camp, directly beneath the bell tower. It had tall stained glass windows and 2 heavy wooden doors. It was the most beautiful building there. But no one ever entered it. Not the counselors, not Father Thomas, not the children. On Sunday morning, I woke early and waited for someone to announce a service. No one did. We ate breakfast, went swimming, and spent the afternoon hiking. There was no mass. There was no Bible study. There were no prayers before meals. No one talked about God. At first, I thought the camp was simply less strict than my church at home. Maybe the adults believed that grieving children needed fun more than religion. On the 3rd night, I decided to pray before dinner. The dining hall was filled with the sound of conversation. Plates scraped against tables. Chairs moved across the floor. Someone laughed near the kitchen. I folded my hands, bowed my head, and whispered, "Dear God, thank you for this food." The room became silent. I opened my eyes. Every person in the dining hall was staring at me. Not angrily, not with confusion. They looked concerned. They looked at me the way an adult looks at a child reaching toward a hot stove. Father Thomas slowly stood from his chair. He walked across the room and stopped beside me. Then he placed one hand on my shoulder. His touch was gentle, but his fingers felt cold. "We don't do that here," he said. He smiled. I nodded and continued eating. No one spoke for several minutes. After dinner, I walked around the camp alone. That was when I noticed the crucifixes. They were everywhere, above doorways, inside cabins, in the dining hall, on the stone walls, beside the walking paths. But none of them had Jesus on them. They were all empty crosses. I searched for other religious symbols. There were no paintings of Jesus, no statues of Mary, no pictures of saints, no Bibles. The camp was named after an angel, run by a priest, and designed like a monastery, but there was almost nothing Christian about it. That night, I told Toby what I had noticed. We were lying in our beds while a counselor sat in a chair near the cabin door. Toby turned his face toward me. "Maybe they don't want to force religion on us," he whispered. "But it's a Catholic camp. Maybe it's just the name. What about Father Thomas? He could be retired." I looked toward the counselor. He was watching us. Toby pulled his blanket up to his chin. "We've all been through bad things," he whispered. "Maybe they just want us to relax." I wanted to believe him. The rest of the summer passed without any obvious danger. We continued swimming, fishing, hiking, and sitting around campfires. Every day was carefully planned. Every meal was perfect. Every counselor remained calm and friendly. After several weeks, I stopped thinking about the chapel. Then it was time to go home. We packed our bags and climbed onto the bus. Only 7 children were there. I sat beside Toby and counted again. Me, Toby, Mac, Nathan, Drew, Jen, and Carly. Mitch was missing. At first, I assumed he was using the bathroom or had forgotten something in the cabin. The bus started moving. "Where's Mitch?" I asked. No one answered. I looked toward the front. The same elderly man was driving, but one of the counselors sat beside him. "Did Mitch leave early?" The driver's hands tightened around the steering wheel. "Let's keep it quiet on the way home," he said. His voice was filled with sudden anger. It was the first time I had heard any adult at St. Gabriel's sound angry. I looked at the other children. No one spoke again. When I arrived home, my mother hugged me and asked if I had enjoyed myself. I told her about the lake, the food, and the campfires. I did not tell her about Mitch. For some reason, the moment I left the bus, thinking about him became difficult. His face felt blurry in my memory. Within a few weeks, I stopped wondering where he had gone. A year passed. The bus returned the following summer. My mother did not ask whether I wanted to go again. She had already packed my suitcase. The same 7 children climbed onto the bus. There was one new boy named Danny. Drew was appointed bus leader. The trip followed the same route. The highways disappeared. The roads turned to gravel. The trees closed around us. By sunset, we reached the clearing. St. Gabriel's looked exactly the same. Father Thomas stood beside the road. "Welcome home," he said. The summer unfolded almost exactly as it had before. We ate the same meals. We followed the same paths. We heard the same stories around the fire. Drew was sometimes taken away from the group to help the counselors, but he never explained what he did. When the summer ended, only 7 of us returned. Drew was gone. No one asked about him. The next year, we returned again. Carly became the bus leader. At the end of the summer, she disappeared. This continued until my 4th summer at St. Gabriel's. By then, I was 15. I had grown taller and less trusting. I remembered Mitch, Drew, and Carly clearly. I had spent months trying to convince my mother not to send me back, but every conversation ended the same way. She said the camp was good for me. She said it was free. She said I always came home looking healthier. That year, the driver appointed me bus leader. The moment he said it, my blood turned cold. When we arrived at St. Gabriel's, I was separated from the other children. A counselor led me past the cabins and through a part of the camp I had never seen. We followed a narrow path behind the chapel and reached a small stone building near the edge of the forest. Inside was a large private room. There was a bed, a desk, a chair, a bathroom, and a small table with a deck of cards. The counselor told me the bus leader received better living conditions because of the extra responsibilities. I waited for him to explain those responsibilities. He did not. For 6 days, I did nothing. They brought meals to my room. I played solitaire for hours. I was not allowed to leave unless a counselor came for me. Every morning, I heard the other children in the distance. I heard laughter near the lake and voices on the hiking trail. At night, I heard the bell tower ring once, although I had never seen anyone inside it. The counselors checked on me regularly. They always asked the same question. Do you feel ready? Ready for what? They never said. On the sixth night, I decided to escape. I waited until after 1 in the morning. When the counselor outside my room walked away, I opened the window and climbed out. The camp was different in darkness. During the day, it looked peaceful. At night, the stone buildings seemed taller. The windows were black. The gardens looked dead beneath the moonlight. There were no insects, no frogs near the lake, no wind in the trees. The silence felt unnatural. I did not know where to go. The bus was gone, and I had no idea how far we were from the nearest town.